Welcome dear audience, students and scholars. Here I am Dr. Mujad Ali. Dear scholars, the two goals of economic policies are low inflation and low unemployment, but often these goals conflict with one another. Suppose for instance that policy makers were to use monetary or fiscal policy to expand aggregate demand. This policy would move the economy along the short-run aggregate supply curve to a point of higher output and a higher price level. So higher output means lower unemployment because firms employ more workers when they produce more. A higher price level given the previous year's price level means higher inflation. Thus, when policymakers move the economy up along the short run aggregate supply curve, they reduce the unemployment rate and raise the inflation rate. Conversely, when they contract the aggregate supply curve and move the economy down the short run aggregate supply curve, unemployment rises and inflation falls. So in this video we are going to discuss inflation, unemployment and the Phillips curve. So let's make the introduction here. The trade-off between inflation and unemployment called the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is a reflection of the short-run aggregate supply curve as policymakers move the economy along the short-run aggregate supply curve. Unemployment and inflation move in opposite direction. The Phillips curve is a useful way to express aggregate supply because inflation and unemployment are such important measures of economic performance. So let's discuss the driving the Phillips curve from the aggregate supply curve. The Phillips curve in its modern form states that the inflation rate depends on three forces. First one is expected inflation. Second, the deviation of unemployment from the natural rate called the cyclical unemployment. Third, supply shocks. These three forces are expressed in the following equation. We have here pi is equal to e pi minus beta into u minus u power n plus v. So here pi reflect inflation and e pi is expected inflation minus beta plus cyclical inflation. When we subtract u minus u power n, we get the cyclical unemployment plus v presents here supply shocks. So here beta is a parameter measuring the response of inflation to cyclical unemployment. Notice that there is a minus sign here given before the cyclical unemployment term. Other thing equals higher unemployment is associated with lower inflation. So here we have one of the main questions to discuss, that where does this equation for the Phillips curve come from? Okay, although it may not seem familiar, we can derive it from our equation for aggregate supply to see how write the aggregate supply equation as we have here P is equal to EP plus 1 over alpha into Y minus Y over bar. Okay, with one addition, one subtraction and one substitution, we can transform this equation into the Phillips curve relationship between inflation and unemployment. So here are the three steps. The first step, add to the right hand side of the equation a supply shock V to represent exogenous event such a change in world oil price that alter the price level and shift the short run aggregate supply curve. So we have here P is equal to EP plus 1 over alpha into Y minus Y over bar plus V. And next, to go from the price level to inflation rate, subtract last year's price level P minus 1 from both sides of the equation to obtain. So here we have P minus 1 is equal to EP minus P minus 1 plus 1 over alpha into Y minus Y over bar plus V. So here the term on the left hand side is the difference between the current price level and the last year price level, which is technically called inflation. The term on the right hand side, that is EP minus P minus, is the difference between the expected price level and last year price level, which is expected inflation, that is EP, or we can we can denote it E pi in our previous equation. So therefore we can replace P minus with pi and EP minus P minus with EP. So we get our equation pi is equal to E pi plus 1 over alpha into Y minus Y over bar plus V. So this is our Phillips curve equation, which we have right in our first slide. Okay, the third, to go from output to unemployment, that's Okun's law gives a relationship between these two variables. Okay, one version of Okun's law states that the deviation of output from its natural level is inversely related to the deviation of unemployment from its natural rate. That is, when output is higher than the natural level of output, unemployment is lower than the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, we can write this equation as 1 over alpha into Y minus Y over bar is equal to minus beta into U minus U per N. So using the Okun's law relationship, we can substitute minus beta into U minus U per N for 1 over alpha into Y minus Y over bar in our previous equation. To obtain, we get pi is equal to E pi minus beta into U minus U N plus V. So this equation can derive the Phillips curve equation from the aggregate supply equation. So all this algebraic derivation is meant to show one thing: the Phillips curve equation and the short run aggregate supply equation represent essentially the same macroeconomic ideas. In particular, both equations show a link between real and nominal variables that causes the classical dichotomy, the theoretical separation of real and nominal variables, which we have done in our previous videos. To break down in the short run, according to the short run aggregate supply equation, output is related to unexpected movements in the price level. According to the Phillips curve equation, unemployment is related to unexpected movements in inflation. So aggregate supply curve is more convenient when we are studying the output and price level, whereas the Phillips curve is more convenient when we are studying unemployment and inflation. But we should not lose sight of the fact that Phillips curve and aggregate supply curve are two sides of the same kind. So let's discuss the further discussion about the adaptive expectation and inflation inertia. Okay, to make the Phillips curve useful for analyzing the choices facing policymakers, we need to specify what determines expected inflation. A simple and often plausible assumption is that people form their expectations of inflation based on recently observed inflation. This assumption is called adaptive expectations. For example, suppose that people expect prices to rise this year at the same rate as they did last year. Then expected inflation E pi equals the last year inflation pi minus 1. So we can write it E pi is equal to pi minus 1. So in this case, we can write the Phillips curve as pi is equal to pi minus beta into u minus u power n plus v, which states that inflation depends on past inflation and cyclical unemployment and a supply shock. Okay, when the Phillips curve is written in this form, the natural rate of unemployment is sometimes called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. We can write it NAIRU. So in the coming session, we will write NAIRU in place of non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Okay, then our first term here is a form of a Phillips curve, and pi minus 1 here implies that inflation has inertia, that is like an object moving through the space. Inflation keeps going unless something acts to stop it. In particular, if unemployment is at non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, there are two supply shocks. We can continue to rise the price level, neither speed up nor slow down. This inertia arises because past inflation influences expectations of future inflation, and because these expectations influence the wages and prices that people set. Robert Solow captured the concept of inflation inertia when during the high inflation of 1970s, he wrote that why is our money ever less value? Perhaps it is simply that we have inflation because we expect inflation, and we expect inflation because we had it. So let's give the further explanation for adaptive expectations and inflation inertia. In the model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, inflation inertia is interpreted as persistent upward shift in both the aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve. First, consider aggregate supply. Prices have been rising quickly. People will expect them to continue to rise quickly because the position of the short-run aggregate supply curve depends on the expected price level, and the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift upward over time. It continues to shift upward until some event such as a recession or a supply shock changes inflation and thereby changes expectations of inflation. Then the aggregate demand curve must also shift upward to confirm the expectations of inflation. Most often, the continued rise in aggregate demand is due to persistent growth in the money supply. If the Fed or the central bank suddenly halted money supply aggregate demand would stabilize, and upward shift in aggregate supply would cause a recession. The high unemployment in the recession would reduce inflation and expected inflation, causing inflation inertia to subside. Okay, moving towards the two causes of rising and falling inflation. Okay, the second and the third terms in the Phillips curve have, and the equation shows that two forces that can change the rate of inflation. The second term, we have beta into U minus U. Overhead shows that cyclical unemployment, the deviation of unemployment from its natural rate exerts upward or downward pressure on inflation. Low unemployment puts the inflation rate up. This is called demand pull inflation because high aggregate demand is responsible for this type of inflation. High unemployment pushes the inflation rate down. The parameter here, beta, measures how responsive inflation to cyclical unemployment. Okay, the third term, which is V, which shows the inflation rate also rises and falls because of supply shock, and a diverse supply shock such as the rise in world oil prices in 1970s implies a positive value of V and causes inflation to rise. This is called the cost push inflation because adverse supply shocks are typically events that push up the cost of production. A beneficial supply shock such as the oil glut that led to a fall in oil prices in 1980s make V negative and causes inflation to fall. Okay, while the further discussion about the inflation, unemployment and Phillips curve, we have here the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Okay, consider the option the Phillips curve gives to a policymakers who can influence the aggregate demand with monetary or fiscal policy. At any moment, expected inflation and supply shocks are beyond the policymakers' immediate control. Yet, by changing aggregate demand, the policymaker can alter output, unemployment, and inflation. So, the policymaker can expand aggregate demand to lower unemployment and raise inflation, or the policymaker can depress aggregate demand to raise unemployment and lower inflation rate in the economy. So let's see a graphical presentation for the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. We have here unemployment U on x-axis, we have inflation rate on our y-axis, and we have a downward sloping negative relationship between inflation and unemployment, and at this point we have UN, and at this point we have expected inflation plus V. So in the short run, inflation and unemployment are negatively related to one another at any point in time. Let's say a policymaker who control aggregate demand can choose a combination of inflation and unemployment on this short run Phillips curve. Let's say 1% or 1 unit change in unemployment brings that much change in inflation rate in the economy. So Phillips curve equation shows the short run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. When unemployment in its natural rate, we have here UN is natural rate of unemployment. Inflation depends on expected inflation plus supply shock. So here expected inflation plus supply shock. The parameter beta determine the slope of the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In the short run, for a given level of expected inflation, policymakers can manipulate aggregate demand to choose any combination of inflation and unemployment on this curve. We can say in the short run we can call it a short run Phillips curve. So here notice that the position of short run Phillips curve depends on expected inflation. If expected inflation rise, the curve shift upward and the policymaker trade-off comes less favorable. Inflation is higher for any given level of unemployment. So let's see another graphical presentation that is shifts in the short run trade-off. So we have income output, we have unemployment U on x-axis, we have inflation rate on y-axis, we have a downward relationship between a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. So we have low expected inflation. As we have discussed that if the expected inflation rises, then we have a shift in the expectation of inflation. So we have a high expected inflation. At this point, we have a natural rate of unemployment. So this figure shows the trade-off depends on the expected inflation. So the short run trade-off between inflation and unemployment depends on expected inflation. The curve is higher when the expected inflation is higher, because people adjust their expectation of inflation over time. The trade-off between inflation and unemployment holds only in the short run. The policymaker cannot keep the inflation above the expected inflation, and thus unemployment below its natural level forever. Eventually, expectation adapt to whatever inflation rate the policymaker has chosen. In the long run, the classical dichotomy holds. Unemployment returns to its natural rate, and there is no trade-off between inflation and unemployment at all. So moving towards a discussion about inflation and unemployment, the Phillips curve, let's discuss the deflation or disinflation and the sacrifice ratio. Imagine an economy in which unemployment is at its natural rate and inflation is running at 6%. So here we have to discuss one of the main questions, that what would happen to unemployment and output if the central bank pursued a policy to reduce inflation from 6 to 2%. Okay, the Phillips curve shows that in the absence of a beneficial supply shock, lowering inflation requires a period of high unemployment and reduced unemployment or reduced output. Okay, but by how much and for how long would unemployment need to rise above the natural rate is one of the main questions here. Okay, before deciding whether to reduce inflation, policymakers must know how much output would be lost during the transition to low inflation. Okay, this cost can then be compared with the benefits of the lower inflation in the economy. Okay, for this, much research has used the available data to examine the Phillips curve quantitatively. The result of these studies are often summarized a number called the sacrifice ratio, the percentage of a year's real GDP that must be foregone to reduce inflation by 1% point. Okay, although estimates of the sacrifice ratio vary substantially, a typical estimate is about 5 for every percentage point that inflation is to fall. 5% of 1 year's GDP must be sacrificed. We can also express the sacrifice ratio in terms of unemployment. Okun's law says that a change of 1 percent point in the unemployment rate translates into a change of 2 percent points in GDP. Therefore, reducing inflation by 1 percent point requires about 2.5 percentage point of typical, or we can say that cyclical unemployment. We can use the sacrifice ratio to estimate by how much and for how long unemployment must rise to reduce inflation. If reducing inflation by 1% point requires a sacrifice of 5% of a year's GDP, reducing inflation by 4% point requires a sacrifice of 20% of a year's GDP. Equivalently, this reduction in inflation requires a sacrifice of 10% points of cyclical or cyclical unemployment. This disinflation could take various forms, each totaling the same sacrifice of 20% of a year's GDP. For example, we can say a rapid disinflation would lower output by 10% for 2 years. This is sometimes called the cold turkey solution to inflation. A moderate disinflation would lower output by 5% for 4 years, and even more gradual disinflation would depress output by 2% for a decade. So moving towards the other discussion related to the inflation, unemployment and the Phillips curve, here we have a rational expectations and the possibility of painless disinflation, because the expectation of inflation influences the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. It is crucial to understand how people form expectations. So far, we have been assuming that expected inflation depends on recently observed inflation. Although this assumption of adaptive expectation is plausible, it is probably too simple to apply in all circumstances. So an alternative approach is to assume that people have rational expectations. That is, we might assume that people optimally use all the available information, including information about current government policies, to forecast the future. Okay, then because monetary and fiscal policies influence inflation, expected inflation should also depends on the monetary and fiscal policies in fact. Okay, then according to the theory of rational expectation, a change in monetary or fiscal policy will change expectations, and evaluation of any policy change must incorporate this effect on expectations. Okay, if people do form their expectation rationally, then inflation may have less inertia than it first appears. Okay, for the further discussion about the rational expectations and the possibility of painless disinflation, thus advocates of the rational expectations argue that short-run Phillips curve does not accurately represent the option that policymakers have available. They believe that if policymakers are credibly committed to reducing inflation, rational people will understand the commitment and will quickly lower their expectations of inflation. Inflation can then come down without a rise in unemployment and fall in output. According to the theory of rational expectations, traditional estimates of the sacrifice ratio are not useful for evaluating the impact of alternative policies. Under a credible policy, the cost of reducing inflation may be much lower than estimates of sacrifice ratio suggest. Okay, while the further discussion about the rational expectations and the possibility of painless disinflation, in the most recent or most extreme case, one can imagine reducing the rate of inflation without causing any recession at all. A painless disinflation has two requirements. First, the plan to reduce inflation must be announced. Therefore, the workers and the firms that set wages and prices have formed their expectations. Second, the workers and the firms must believe the announcement, otherwise they will not reduce their expectations of inflation. So in both requirements are met, the announcement will immediately shift the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment downward, permitting a low rate of inflation without higher unemployment. So although the rational expectations approach remain controversial, almost all economists agree that expectations of inflation influence the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Okay, the credibility of a policy to reduce inflation is therefore one determinant of how costly the policy will be. But unfortunately, it is often difficult to predict whether the policy will view the announcement of a new policy as credible. The central role of expectations make forecasting the results of alternative policies far more difficult. So let's move toward the hysteresis and the challenge to the natural rate hypothesis. Our discussion of the cost of disinflation and indeed our entire discussion of economic fluctuations in the past 4 chapters have been emphasized, we can say that has been based on an assumption called the natural rate hypothesis. This hypothesis is summarized in the following statement. Okay, fluctuations in aggregate demand affect output and employment only in the short run. In the long run, the economy returns to the levels of output, employment, and unemployment described by the classical model. Okay, the natural rate hypothesis allows macroeconomists to study separately short-run and long-run developments in the economy. It is one expression of the classical dichotomy. So some economists, however, have challenged the natural rate hypothesis by suggesting that aggregate demand may affect output and employment even in the long run. They have pointed out a number of mechanisms through which recessions might leave permanent scars on the economy by altering the natural rate of unemployment. So hysteresis is the term used to describe the long-lasting influence of history on the natural rate. So for the further discussion about the hysteresis and the challenge to the natural rate hypothesis, a recession can have permanent effects if it changes the people who become unemployed. For instance, workers might lose valuable job skills when unemployed, lowering their ability to find a job even after the recession ends. Alternatively, a long period of unemployment may change an individual's attitude to work and reduce his desire to find employment. In either case, the recession permanently inhibits the process of job search and raises the amount of frictional unemployment. Another way in which a recession can permanently affect the economy is by changing the process that determines wages. Those who become unemployed may lose their influence on the wage setting process. Unemployed workers may lose their status as union members, for example. So, more generally, some of the insiders in the wage setting process become outsider if the smaller group of insiders cares more about high real wages and less about high employment. Then the recession may permanently push real wages further above the equilibrium level and raise the amount of structural unemployment. Hysteresis remain a controversial theory. Some economists believe the theory helps explain persistently high unemployment in Europe because the rise in European unemployment starting in the early 1980s coincided with the disinflation but continued after inflation stabilized. Moreover, the increase in unemployment tend to be larger for those countries that experienced the greatest reduction in inflation, such as Ireland, Italy and Spain. Yet there is still no consensus on whether the hysteresis phenomena is significant or why it might be more pronounced in some countries than in others. So if it is true, however, the theory is important because hysteresis greatly increases the cost of recession. Put another way, hysteresis raises the sacrifice ratio because output is lost even after the period of disinflation is over. So this is all about inflation, unemployment and the Phillips curve. So see you with another video. Ciao.